Now, as we began to investigate this, and we used all the kind of resources that investigators do, we look at every kind of book, every kind of official report, etc., diaries, letters, we realised it was an enormous story, and it was also something which refuted one of the great ideas, one of the key ideas of the development of slavery, which is that in 1619 slavery began in America with the arrival of 20 and odd Negroes, as they were called, sold, according to accounts, by a Dutch captain to planters in England, and this was where slavery began. Well, it wasn't true. Slavery had begun earlier. Children and women and convicts had been sold earlier than that, and although a small number of Africans were subsequently brought to Virginia and sold over the next decades, only very few, only 350 years later. 20 years later. But meantime, hundreds, thousands of poor whites were being brought in, and on various convicts and children, etc., and they were being enslaved.
Well, after hearing that, you might be wondering, well, why haven't I heard about this? Perhaps that's because Hollywood never saw fit to make a multi-million-dollar movie about the topic. If we as a people even knew etymology better, we would have already figured out that the word slave itself comes from the word Slav, as in Eastern European descent. To be fair, all races at one point or another have suffered from slavery in some way, but white slavery specifically has been a huge reality in the history of the world that even Wikipedia, notorious for being selective about their histories themselves, have been forced to host an entire page on. This page goes over not hundreds of years of history, but thousands of years of proof of white slavery in the world. For example, well over 1 million Christian slaves were sold to Muslim masters via the African slave traders.
This is the story of the slave trade between Europe and Africa, a tragic tale of coastal villages raided and men, women and children carried off into captivity, loaded onto ships, taken to be sold as slaves in another continent and never seeing their homes again. A familiar enough narrative, except that in this case, the villages being depopulated in this way were English, and the slave traders arrived in ships which had sailed from Africa. Long before the British ever became involved in the slave trade, slavers out of Africa were raiding not only the British Isles, but many other European countries. From Iceland to Malta, Ireland to Spain, and Italy to the Netherlands, carrying off white slaves to be sold in the slave markets of Africa. The Barbary pirates were actually after people, white Christians specifically, who could be sold as slaves in Muslim countries. Slavery was an old African tradition, and it is not to be wondered at that it flourished on what became known as the Barbary coast. Of course, everybody knows about Europeans going to Africa and taking the people off into slavery. It's taught in schools. White slavery is not so well known. The Barbary coast was named after the Berbers who originally lived there, and included countries like Algeria, Tunisia and modern-day Morocco. From ports there, Muslims set off to Europe to seize as many white Christians as they could for the slave markets of North Africa.
The stereotype from establishment history is that of a Muslim slaver herding chained blacks through the desert, when in fact, for 700 years until the fall of Muslim Spain, those being herded were first and foremost notoriously white. The fate of the hundreds of thousands of white slaves sold to the Arabs was described in Spanish texts as atrocima et ferocima, most atrocious and harsh. The men were worked to death as galley slaves. The women, girls, and boys were used as prostitutes. Dr. John Adzuma estimates in his 2001 book that slavers in these parts engaged in the incredible heinous practice of castration of both white and black men and boys to bring their highest priced specialty slave called the eunuch to the market. It is thought that 6 out of 10 men and boys died in this process. Now, this was done not only to stop their nature of retaliation, as well to make them best suited for guarding their other favorite slaves, their sex slaves known as a harem, many of which were also white. Now, eunuchs have been used for millennia in a variety of cultures. For example, according to author Ronald Siegel in his 2002 book, The Khalifa in Baghdad at the beginning of the 10th century, he had over 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs in his palace. I guess their white privilege did not save the white slaves that were children and women and eunuchs the same fate of their black counterparts. We suffered this atrocity together. Another story that we were never told by Hollywood or historians that could have brought us together instead of apart. All over European seas and coasts, the Barbary pirates in the 16th and 17th centuries constantly ransacked ships ran by Europeans, where they emptied them out, chained them up, and hauled them off to sell in northern Africa.
How extensive was this trade? Was it a trifling affair of a few hundred people here and there? Hardly. The island of Gozo, part of modern Malta, was attacked in July 1551 and the entire population of 5,000 people taken off into slavery. The sack of Baltimore in Ireland gives one good example of what was going on at that time. The entire population was removed. This was a serious problem for Europe, especially in the Mediterranean countries, but also for Britain and even Iceland. Current estimates suggest that the number of Europeans captured and taken to Africa numbered in the millions.
Yet we were all taught the romantic and entertaining stories of the pirates, those radical and lovable fellows, but not afraid to walk you off the plank in their search for treasure, right? But our history books, cartoons, and films failed to show us that, in fact, they were deep into the business of the snatching and sale of souls. And white Christians were their favorite variety. European slaves were acquired by these pirates in slave raids on coastal towns from Italy to France, England, Portugal to the Netherlands, even Iceland, and taken to Africa for their sale. European men, women, and children were captured to such a devastating extent in these seacoast towns that vast numbers of them were abandoned for fear of this dreaded fate. Now, we all know that America abolished slavery in 1865, right? But how many knew that it wasn't until 1904 that an agreement in Paris regarding the international white slave traffic was penned? The International Agreement for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic geared in great part again to the white women, little girls, and little boys that were still being commonly sold as sex slaves. Why haven't your women activists told you that story, huh? In the early 1600s, whites, mostly Irish, and African blacks were enslaved together in the sugar plantations in the West Keys and places like Barbados. Perhaps you find yourself wondering whatever became of those white slaver pirates. Well, when you consider the fact that President Thomas Jefferson, starting in the year 1800, brought the U.S. Navy back to life for the purpose of one of our country's very first military operations, the Barbary Wars, to stop the pirates' extortion and terror of white enslavement against U.S. merchant ships, and they did so quite successfully, you then must consider that your U.S. history books never told you that, and therefore you must deeply question everything else they taught you. Yep, whites were slaves too, even before the first African was brought into America, and when one can scarcely think of whites as slaves, the mind first thinks, well, surely they were treated better, right, than what we hear the black slaves were treated later on. But in the documents, when you dig deep, paint a very different story. Like those found in the records of Middlesex Country, Virginia, whippings were commonplace, as were iron collars and chains. The horrifying treatment was not an uncommon reality of whites in bondage in the colonies, but it was so common, in fact, that the whipping of white slaves resulted in so many being beaten to death that in 1662, the Virginia Assembly passed a law prohibiting the private burial of white slaves because such burials helped to conceal murders by their masters. The Georgia Northampton County court records show us that Anthony Johnson sought to legally become the first to own a slave for life in America. Anthony Johnson was black. So the first legally appointed slave for life, a man named John Cassor, happened because Anthony and Mary Johnson, black owners of a tobacco farm in Virginia, fought to win the judicial determination of a slave for life. Wow. One may think when hearing that, well, surely that's an exception. When, in fact, after slavery became a common institution, slave owning by free blacks was so common that in the period of the Commonwealth, it went on unnoticed. I mean, there was no criticism of it. By those who recorded the times, there was abundant proof found in various court records and legislative petitions. According to historian R. Halliburton Jr., there were approximately 319, 599 free blacks in the United States. 1830, okay, this is 35 years before slavery was abolished, right? Yet, at the same time, there were 3,775 free blacks who owned 12,740 black slaves. Why weren't we told this in Black History Month? Furthermore, how many times are we told about the awful scene in the Trail of Tears in school? Guys, I remember getting so upset about that. I remember crying about that in school. And yet, how many times did we learn that the Native Americans brought with them through their displacement their black slaves? Oh, I think they left that out. Yet, historian Tyra Miles placed the number of enslaved blacks held by Cherokee Nation at around 1,500 black slaves at the time of their westward removal in 1838 through 1839. The Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, she said, held around 3,500 black slaves across the three nations as the 19th century began. Wow. And as for the percentage, the real actual world percentage of white families who actually owned slaves, which should be taken into deep consideration when we see pictures like this. According to Adam Rothman, a historian at Georgetown University, he was quoted as saying that using census numbers for 1840, the percentage of families owning slaves was 7.4%. To make the slavery in American narrative even more complicated, as it should be, because it is, in fact, we know that Black and Native Americans also came to own white slaves in Virginia. Yay! If more Blacks knew that what has done the most to harm them were the lies that they've been programmed to believe through their music, through the media, the lies that money will fulfill them, the lies that women are to be used and throw away, the lies that we've all suffered under believing, that promiscuity is better, that men are always toxic, that women should be dominating men as well as dominating the world. Women, our gift is in our ability to nurture, our empathy, our ability to be flexible and supportive, yet your feminist movement has destroyed you and your family. We're taught that pride and narcissism and love of self is proof of happiness. All the while, Americans have suffered to some degree under the lies of all these programs. I do believe that Blacks have suffered and been targeted far more deeply in this endgame that we are all seeing unfold right now, with the victim oppressor psyop coming to a head, so that we will all willingly take part in this Civil War 2.0 designed to destroy each other, rather than stopping and taking a good long hard look at who's pulling the strings. Our history was written by the victors, and for them, their ultimate victory of controlling the entire planet through a new world order is not yet in their grasp. But it's close, real close. And for them, this is a winner-takes-all ending, and they're not above using us against each other in order to achieve it. In fact, because we outnumber them by so much, they have to. They have no other choice. Until they are able to integrate technology into our body itself, it's the only way. And so, we choose to tell them to stick their chaos instigating measures used to divide us, where the sun don't shine, and we choose to love each other. We choose to turn off the news and turn off the media and ignore the celebrities that are selected to deceive us. We choose empathy for the plight of all people, of all colors that have been misled by those who consider themselves illumined. Just say no.